My name is Luke. We are here for the February edition of Ember NYC. If you're in the wrong place, now's the time to sneak out. No, seriously, good to have you all here. I want to say thank you in particular to Movable Link for hosting. Michael, where are you? Michael Madrid, Spencer, other Movable Link folks, you can identify yourselves, right? Movable Link has hosted several times recently, and hopefully will be more in the future. So we really appreciate them having us out and sharing their pizza and beer with us. Yeah, awesome. Round of applause. Good stuff. Anything else that people should know? Perpetual hiring machine. Awesome. Cool. My company that also helps make this happen through my time primarily is Yap. I have a sticker. I also have Ember NYC stickers. This is the Statue of Liberty Ember edition, Thompson edition. So if you're interested in one of these, find me during the meetup or after, and I'm happy to share. Yap is also hiring. We're not perpetually hiring, but we are hiring at the moment. So let me know if you're interested. Tons of Ember Rails in the back end, lots of open source consumption and contribution. I'm going to make a couple of announcements about the meetup and stuff going on in the community, and then I'm going to open up the floor to announcements from you. So if your company is also hiring, or you have events that people should know about, or anything else that you'd like to share with the group, you can come up in just a minute and say that, so be thinking. This is meetup.com. I'm sure that you all know about this and hopefully are all members of Ember NYC's meetup group. If you're not, please do that. We've got a couple of events coming up that Ember NYC events coming up that I want to let you know about. The first one is going to be in the beginning of March, and we don't have a date yet, but Ollie, where are you, Ollie? Ollie is going to be doing a trial run of the workshop that he's doing at EmberConf about broccoli. So basically, if you attend, not only would you be helping him prep for it, but you'll be getting a ton of value at no cost to you. It's free. Yes, free workshop coming up there. So we're going to stay tuned to the meetup. We'll be announcing that soon. We just need to line up the venue and date. The fourth Thursday in March, which somebody help me with the date if you have it handy. 20. I don't know. Somebody will tell us. 22nd. Thank you. So the fourth Thursday in March, March 22nd, we're going to be back with the Ember NYC Evening of Talks, with our headline speaker being Ed Faulkner coming down from the Boston area, and he's going to be focused on taking us through some of the key things that were introduced at EmberConf this year. So that'll be great. You won't want to miss it. Speaking of EmberConf, there are still tickets available March 13th and 14th with an optional workshop stay on the 12th. That is happening in Portland, Oregon. If anybody has not been to Portland, Oregon, I cannot think of a better excuse than EmberConf. It's a great city. It's a great conference. I'll be there so we can hang out. And I think a lot of other people in the room. Raise your hand if you're planning on going to EmberConf. Cool. So good New York contingent. So I think that's it for my announcements. Anybody else have something they'd like to share with the group? Come on up. Ladies and gentlemen, pizza eating Isaac Easer.
Thanks, Luke. Hey, I'm Isaac from 201 Created. My colleague Corey's here. Every year we help organize the Ember Community Survey, and you might have seen on Twitter that we just launched it yesterday, so I want to encourage everybody to fill it out. Remind all your colleagues to fill it out, particularly if you're one of those companies that has like hundreds of developers, Ember developers, which we have seen in the survey. People check that box, and we're like, make sure you tell all your colleagues to fill it out. So yeah, please. That's going to be open till March 7th, just for a few days before EmberConf, so we can kind of aggregate the results, and then we'll be announcing the results at the conference. So please do remember to fill that out. Thanks.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, survey is great, and the more people that contribute, the more useful the information is. Okay, any other announcements? Anything else we should cover? Cool, then we're gonna get into it. What we've got in the lineup tonight is we've got 3 lightning talks, then we're gonna take a short break, and then we've got our headline talk with Katie, who's gonna be talking to us about Ember 3.0, what's changed, what's coming, and definitely a topic on everybody's mind. I just upgraded our first app this week, went pretty smoothly, so I'm excited about that. But first, lightning talks, which if you don't know are 5 to 10 minute talks on various Ember related topics. Our first speaker is going to talk to us about speeding up his test suite. Please help me welcome Gaurav Munjal. Awesome. Let me do it this one. Either one. Okay.
How do you want to do this?
Throw that on your lapel so we get it for the folks at home.
Yeah, perfect. Just put it right on there.
How's that working? I don't hear a thing.
Oh, you won't hear a thing. You'll have to be loud. Is that all right?
Is that all right? Okay. I thought this was a mic. Okay, everyone. I am going to be talking about a topic that most of you probably think is old hat. It's continuous integration. Well, continuous integration is all about running your tests before you commit any code to your master or your main branch. Vesterly had about 200 acceptance tests, maybe 1,000 tests total, not enough to really spend 30 minutes doing continuous integration. It was rather ridiculous, and I figured we had to do something about it. Before I begin, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the problem is. Besides that it was taking 30 minutes, sometimes 40 minutes, the build would check out, it would install dependencies, it would test and deploy sequentially, it would minimally cache. Our caching was only based on the branch, so if we happened to be on a different branch, the cache was no good. And so basically, how do we run this all faster? This entire talk is inspired by this guy's blog post. Just came out January 27. And I looked at this blog post and I said, whoa, here are some really cool ideas on how to make my test suite faster. So what's the solution to this problem? Well, it's Circle CI 2.0 and it's Ember exam. Now, I'm going to use the word workflows a lot, so let's talk about this. We're talking about taking a whole bunch of jobs together. When one job ends, the next one begins, and putting them in a ranged tree to run intelligently. For those of you who don't know Trent Willis's library, Ember exam, this is the secret to running your Ember tests in parallel. It's really simple. Ember install, Ember exam. You split your test page into several test pages, and you add the -- parallel option. But that's not going to work on a container with 4 gigabytes of RAM, like Circle CI or Travis will provide you. So here's what we're looking for in our opportunities. We want parallelism. We want to run tests in parallel. But if we're going to run our tests in parallel, we don't want to take up several containers for the entire time we're building, we're installing our dependencies, we're checking out our code, we're deploying to the server. So we only want to run our tests in parallel. We want our caching to be intelligent. We want to use caches basically based on our yarn.lock file. So this file is, of course, the best indicator of whether your dependencies need to be reinstalled or not. If it hasn't changed, go ahead and use the dependencies you used last time. And obviously, we don't want to pay for extra containers. We are constantly adding containers, and it's not really helping. So adding containers and paying for them is definitely not something we want to do, so we want to efficiently use containers. And this is the sort of flow that we created. We check out our code in one job. We install dependencies in another job. We build our test package in a third job. Then we split into 5 containers for only about 5 minutes max. At this point, we run our tests in all these separate containers. I actually grabbed the lint.js task that recent versions of Ember have added and made that a separate job as well, because there's no reason to wait for that before going on. And if everything passes, we then can deploy. So I'm about to go into the implementation. Warning for anyone who's not seen code before, you're about to see a lot of it. But if you want to follow along, I've created this little URL you can type into your laptop right now, and you can follow along as we go. So you can actually see the code instead of just looking at the screen. So we're going to start at the top. We've got some defaults, and this is going to be appended to every single job that we run. It just basically specifies the image that we're going to choose. Now, CircleCI has a whole lot of images to choose from, much more than Travis CI. And one of the beautiful things about it is that you've got images with the specific version of Node you need pre-installed. And you also have the Dash browsers installs all the browsers in the image. So you don't have to worry about installing Chrome, for example, on CircleCI like you would on Travis to get the latest version of Chrome. The working directory is set up labs. We actually specify the time zone so that we don't have any time zone issues with our tests. This is actually something I would like to stop doing because I would like to know if our tests break because of time zones, but that's something we do right now. The version is number 2, and we're going to start talking about the jobs right now. 2 specifies CircleCI 2.0. CircleCI 1.0 is almost a one-for-one comparison with what Travis has today, but CircleCI 2.0 involves all these workspaces, workflows, and intelligent caching features that I'm about to show you. So the defaults you saw on the previous screen, that just sort of goes in here. We're going to check out which runs some code to git check our code. And then we're going to persist to a workspace. Now, a workspace in CircleCI 2.0 is something like a cache, but it's more temporary and it's used within the workflow. So when your workflow is finished, it blows away. But it allows you to share the state of your code between one job and the next. This is what install dependencies look like. Don't worry if it's small because I'm about to go through the pieces. But I just want to show you what the whole thing looks like before I start. So you're attaching the workspace that you got from the previous job at the current directory, which is /labs if you were reading the defaults just a minute ago. We have to add some SSH keys in order to be able to do our work. And this is unfortunate. Right now we have to make sure GitHub is a known host. CircleCI 2.0 is still pretty new, and hopefully we'll be able to get rid of that line soon. So in the beginning of our install dependencies, we have a restore cache, and at the end we have a save cache. This specifies the keys, as well as, and the save cache also specifies the path. The v1 is very useful in case we ever have to manually blow away our cache. We can just increment that number to whatever and it will totally ignore a previous cache, and it won't blow away all the caches that we're talking about today. The depths is the name of the cache we're talking about. It's our dependencies cache. The dot branch will just refer to the branch that we're in. And finally, we're going to look at yarn.lock's checksum in order to determine whether to use the cache or not. Now, when you save a cache, you specify the entire list. But when you restore the cache, you will first try to find an exact match, then try to find a match without the yarn.lock checksum, and then fall back to any cache that just starts with v1 depths. This is pretty useful for the fact that if we switch to a different branch, we still have a cache. We still have something going. And if yarn.lock changes, we create a whole new cache for that particular yarn.lock. If my branch has one yarn.lock and branch B has a second yarn.lock, and I throw an update on my branch and he throws an update on his branch, we use separate caches. So very intelligent about that. These are the 5 directories I'm caching. Basically, node modules and Bower components is pretty obvious. The others have to do with yarn. In between these two, we have our install global dependencies, which is a shell script I'm about to show you. We're going to mess with the path a little so that it'll actually find yarn and node mod Ember and all that. And then we'll yarn install. We still have Bower, unfortunately, so we're Bower install too. This is our install global dependencies.shell. If .yarn doesn't exist already, we go to Yarn's homepage and we install a version of Yarn on the machine. This is mainly because the image doesn't always have the most up-to-date version of Yarn. And we found in the past that if we update Yarn on our local machines and then don't update on the CI, the yarn.locks aren't always compatible. So it's kind of more important to get the latest version of Yarn in this scenario than we'd like. Last I checked, they have 1.3.2 up there, and that's still the latest. So this isn't being used much, but nonetheless, we have it in there because it does change pretty often. Then we add Node SAS, Ember CLI, Bower, a whole bunch of ESLint plugins. And these are the things we just need installed globally. After we've installed our dependencies, we're going to build our test code. Now, one of the things you'll see here is that we also have a cache for the build test code. What is this for? Well, I discovered that I could actually make Ember build faster if I saved a few directories like temp and build cache. I specified build cache to be our broccoli persistent filter cache in our build process. So in our Ember CLI build. By the way, David over there in the back allowed me to open source all this code. He unfortunately, isn't going to let us open source our whole repo, but it's definitely makes this convenient for you guys to follow along and to learn from it yourself. So yeah, we build our test. I use a path. So there's a test dist path, and this allows me to share this particular build with all my tests. So I'm not building over and over again for each of the tests that I'm running. And I'm going to move on. Lint.js is pretty obvious. You just yarn run it. It's fairly simple. But by moving it into a separate job, it runs in parallel with all the other tests. Run tests 1, 2, 3, and 4 are pretty much all the same. The only difference is -- partition equal becomes 2, 3, and 4. We could use environment variables to shorten the code a bit, but I kind of worked on this in a single day, so it was just easier not to bother with too many environment variables and special learning all kinds of syntax for reusing these workflows. But other than that, we're still just going to attach a workspace. We're going to mess with the path a little bit so it finds Ember, and then we're going to run our tests. The jobs equal 1, I'm hoping it's not going to be required for very long, but it's currently required because when you run tests, it creates a whole bunch of internal processes and the containers do run out of memory very fast. So this ensures that it only uses one process. Finally, we're going to deploy the development after we finished. We're going to have our steps to simply pretty much do the same thing where we set up our Git known host. Now we do happen to do a changelog here, and that is pushed to Git. So we do need to set up some fake username and user email to follow along with that. We're using Ember CLI deploy, so the command to deploy is Ember deploy development. And we have our changelog set up, so we just yarn run changelog and we create our changelog. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and listening to my talk. You can take a look at this URL for all the code and follow along again. And finally, my name's Gaurav Munjal. I work at Vesterly. I have my Twitter handle, my GitHub, my LinkedIn, all that good stuff here, my website. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. We have time for a couple of questions. If anybody has any questions for Gaurav. Cool. All right. Next up, direct from Maine, New Jersey Transit. We have our friend Ray Tiley back in New York. Ray told me the topic, something about mockups, but I have no idea what he's going to talk about really. But I'm sure it's going to be good.
Am I supposed to wear something?
Yeah, tap that to your sweatshirt there. There you go. All right. Let's give it up for Ray.
Is this thing working? All right. Awesome. Thanks, everyone, for having me. I'm really excited about Katie's talk since my app is still on 1.13 and I have a bit of upgrading to do. So I'm dedicating this lightning talk to Chad. Chad used to work for the company I worked at, and I kind of threw him at this task, the thing I'm about to talk about. And I said, hey, this is really cool when it was done. Like, you should write a blog post about it. And he didn't, so now I get all the credit. So what I'm going to talk about is something that I think is like really obvious, but I haven't seen anyone write a blog post about it or do a talk. So if everyone's doing this, I apologize for wasting your time. So I work remotely. That's what it's like to work in Maine. Luke knows. He's worked at my co-working space. He's actually off to the corner there. And so my team is highly distributed. I live in Maine. One of my guys works in Minneapolis. We have another guy in Canada. We have salespeople all over the country. We use Slack a lot. And so a lot of times it's like, I built this cool thing and I need feedback on it, right? Like I need to show it to someone. And like people are at lunch a lot when your company is like spread over 4 or 5 time zones. And so while like getting people, and also we have lots of different stakeholders. While like getting feedback from one person is really great, lots of times I want feedback from another developer, I want feedback from a salesperson, I want feedback from one of the support or quality assurance technicians. Like, I want a lot of people to give me feedback, and being a remote company, it's really hard to like pin people down. It's really hard to like make myself available for when I actually get people that want to respond to my request for feedback. And so in-person reviews are great. Like, it's great when you work at an office space and you can like grab someone and like make them sit next to you, but it's not really realistic most of the time. And so I would love to say that like we had this like problem and like I came up with this awesome idea, but that's not really how it happened. What happened was we were already using Ember CLI Mirage, and so we had this like way in development to kind of have fake data. And we used it a lot for development, like making scenarios and kind of like working through a problem and reusing the data over and over again without having to spin up a dev server every time. And then I saw this guy with great pants give a talk about Ember CLI deploy, and I was like, I wonder if we could, you know, put those two together. And so for a totally contrived example, if I come in here into my app. Sorry, I was looking for a picture for that slide. And so this is the app I work on now. We have a couple different apps, and I've been on multiple teams at my company. This is Cablecast. It's automation software for TV stations. So if anyone live in the Bronx? All right, well, we run that, like the whole BronxNet, like TV network, and we run a couple other ones. That's the one that's closest to here that I can think of. So anyway, this is like kind of the main dashboard. And you know, my sales manager is like, you know, thumbnails are really cool. The show that's playing right there, I want a thumbnail on it. And so like, I come into my code, and I kind of find that component. Don't shame me, like I said, I'm on Ember 1.13. And so I put the thumbnail here. So this is kind of, you know, a very Ember-ish way to do it. I have an image tag, and I use a property of my model, and I refresh it. And it will rebuild, and I get the thumbnail where I want it. And it's like, no, well, you know, maybe it would actually be, maybe I'll undo that. And I'll put it on the left, you know, like, feng shui-wise, it's just not working there. So I'll put it right here. Kind of, oops. Sweet Ember errors. What did I do wrong? Oh, come on. All right, so what does it look like on the left side? That looks totally wrong, but sure, I'll go for it. So now I kind of want some feedback. I want to try both different things. And so what I just do is I'm going to type Ember deploy UI preview. And so give it a second to build. My laptop's at 43% battery, so it's probably running at half speed right now. So that's going to throw this up to S3. And it's going to use the Ember Mirage data as the data source, and it's just going to live there on S3. The other things it's going to do is if we come to our Slack channel and go into our deployments channel, you're going to see it's going to post a message. I think this just happened. No, that happened when I was testing it a few seconds ago. So give it a second. My computer like really hates being on low battery. Does anyone else have this problem with their Mac? Like, it's bad. So cool, so in a few seconds, we'll get a message into our deployments channel. Come on. Come on, internet. There we go. All right, so there we go. So local development build deployed to this crazy URL. And I can click on this, and the internet's going to make the loading spinner stay up for a nice long time. But eventually, I get on S3 this UI preview, and I can share that as a link to some of my coworkers. I can also then come back, and I'm not going to actually do it because it would take a while because my computer's on really low battery. But I could do the same thing for the other one. I could put it on the right side and send a UI preview up. So how does that work? It's actually like ridiculously simple. So I install the 2 add-ons, I get them working. In the deploy config, we basically had Chad follow the S3 walkthrough example on their doc site. And then, he gold-plated a little bit and added a Slack webhook. He also added a webhook that posts the link to the preview on S3 when a pull request happens. So if we go and look at our pull requests, any pull request in this will get the UI preview deployed to it automatically. So I can just go there and see what that pull request looks like with fake data. Oops. And then, so that was all straight Ember CLI deploy stuff that we did. And then the only real thing that we had to do, and there's probably better ways to do this, but in our production environment, we set the location to hash. In the real app, we actually do this behind a flag. And then in the, if we detect Ember CLI deploy, we just enable Ember CLI Mirage. And so that happens as part of a build step. So kind of 2 config lines in your environment.js, and you can get basically running builds on S3 backed with Mirage data. And we get them linked into Slack automatically. We use them to do polls. Like we'll set up a little Slack poll, be like, hey, which one do you like better? And they get put as part of every pull request. So we do the test build, and then we do a UI preview build as part of our test suite. And so we use AppVeyor because most of our backend is on Windows. So you can see here somewhere on success, we do a node Ember deploy UI preview for every build. So some shameless begging. I'm sure, like I said, I'm on 113. I'm not really good on keeping up to date. This might be a thing already. The only thing that would make this really sweet or better for us is if the scenarios in Mirage, and I'm looking at the person directly responsible, if the Mirage scenarios, if we had a way to like create a Mirage scenario per branch or something, so that we could like, when we're trying to do these experiments, we could like really tweak the default data for that thing. And it probably is already possible. It's just not really straightforward or called out in the docs. And I just haven't really spent time to do it. But other than that, this works really well for us. And it takes about 10 minutes to set up now that I've told you how to do it. And it's cool. So thanks.
Potentially that could also then fit in with Ember Mirage, where selecting a different feature flag or area.
Yeah, totally. So the question is, have we thought about using feature flags to kind of be able to like enable these experiments and then trigger the different Mirage, Ember CLI Mirage data to kind of go along with those experiments? Is that sort of what you're asking?
Yeah, and like something in the UI so that the person.
Yeah. So we're not there yet. We have a pretty small engineering team, and so we're not really doing the feature flag stuff yet. We want to get there. One thing that we do sometimes is if we really are trying to like call out a scenario, we'll just kind of create like a controller action with like a button that looks like crap in the UI that we know we'll remove later, and that will like be our thing to like set up the test kind of thing. Like, make this error situation. We'll just put the button there, deploy the UI preview, and give people a link. Be like, hey, click this button, and then tell us what you think about what happens afterwards. But we're not at the point where we're wrapping it all behind feature flags yet. But it would be cool.
Cool. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Did you just leave those builds up for a while?
Oh, yeah. So that's the other hidden sauce. Is on S3, you can actually, we set the bucket to delete content after 30 days. So it automatically purges anything after 30 days. And that's just a setting in S3. I would log in and find it for you, but just trust me, it's there. Just Google it. So yeah, all the UI previews only stay up for 30 days. And I didn't really go into it, but the PR-based like URLs are based on the number of the GitHub pull request. And so every time we make a change to the same PR and throw it up, it replaces the existing like deployment. So like people can use the same link over and over again and get like what it currently looks like. The developer previews are just based on like datetime.now-dev, like when I type it into the console myself, and we don't do enough of them that will ever hit a conflict. So those are just one-offs.
Cool. Off the top of my head, if using environment variables to then do stuff in your config file.
Did that change?
Like the per branch strategy I would pursue.
Cool.
Just like you used like the deploy target.
Yeah.
In Ember. Same idea.
Cool. So is anyone doing this? All right, sweet. So it wasn't plainly obvious. All right, awesome. Thank you.
Cool. All right, thanks, Reggie. All right. So we have talked about build speed and workflows in Circle CI. Talked about feedback and previews, getting a good sense of what your app is looking like in development and PRs. So another kind of workflow, right? Development workflow. The next talk is going to also be in the same theme of workflows. And those of you who, just out of curiosity, who has integrated Ember Freestyle into your workflow at all? Cool, a few people. I won't steal any of Christian's thunder, but there's some new stuff in Ember Freestyle that I think you'll all find interesting, and if you aren't using it yet, maybe this will entice you to check it out. So please help me welcome Chris LoPresto.
All right. So Mike, excellent. All right. Thanks, Luke. All right. My name is Chris LoPresto. I work at Betterment. I lead some front-end architecture there, and I also play the piano, as you can plainly see from that picture. I didn't realize, and I really, really liked it. I didn't realize that like dedicating the talk would be a good idea. So I would like to dedicate this talk to Ray Tiley, because that was awesome. All right, so I want to talk to everyone about Ember Freestyle. This is an add-on that we put out about 2 years ago now, and it makes it super easy to add a component explorer to your Ember app. So, at EmberConf 2 years ago, sorry, there we go, I called it Living Style Guide Driven Development. Kind of wish I'd use the term component-driven development and like a component guide or component explorer instead of a living style guide. But that's all right. Let's talk about sort of what it does. I think a component guide you could sort of think of as an interface to present and interact with your app components. So that's your live presentation code base, like your actual app bits. I'll put this back here. But the idea is that you're presenting your application components in isolation, like outside of the context of your apps. You're not depending on any sort of path, like there's no path dependency to get into a certain state to see a certain component a certain way. It's just present it in isolation somewhere. And all sorts of benefits sort of fall out from this. It makes it much easier to prototype, get feedback on designs, to kind of look at different components in ways that you might not see routinely in your day-to-day. And it also makes it easy to get going on a project if you're new to it, because you don't need to dig into a whole app to understand something. You don't need a whole environment up in every way to start working on a single component somewhere. So anyway, that's kind of why Luke and I first started talking about something, and we got it into add-on shape. I'd like to sort of show you like a pretty good public one that I found. This sort of gives an idea of what we're talking about. So this is an add-on. It's Ember Material Components. And in the add-on dummy site, they used Freestyle to just show all of the different components that they are providing. You can sort of see the code that, the handlebars that would then generate all of the different things that we're looking at. You can, there's some different controls where you can toggle certain things, focus certain things. It makes it easy to, with live reload to develop these things. You can focus in on whatever you happen to be working on. You can share this URL with coworkers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of about where Ember Freestyle started out. I think it was really good living self-documentation. The add-on kind of, you just Ember and install Ember Freestyle, and it gets you a lot of stuff. So what I would like to dig into is some new stuff. So actually, one more technical thing that I want to quickly go through. The only thing that you really know, like, so everything is components. All of our apps, components, turtles all the way down. So Ember Freestyle ships a bunch of components to sort of make what you just saw here. Like there's a guide component, there's section nav component, there's this component for focusing, there's this magic component in the middle that makes it so that you can see your application. Let me get a better one. You can see your application component along with the handlebars that would generate it. And that component is called Freestyle Usage. So if you had a component called xfoo, like this, you would use it in your app just with that one line. If you want to show it in your Ember Freestyle guide, you just wrap it in Freestyle Usage, and then you get stuff like this. Happy to dig into detail further, but that should be good enough for now. So at this point, I just kind of want to shift gears. Some of the updates that we're talking about, or that just landed in the 0.70 release we put out this week, came from this guy, Dan Wenzel, who's at PagerDuty. He gave a talk last year at the Austin meetup that is actually one of the best ways to kind of learn how to get going with Freestyle, because we're still light on certain documentation, heavy on certain boilerplate. So what he did, coincidentally, was show how you could create an Ember Freestyle sort of component guide for Ember Observer. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with Ember Observer, but Katie, Phil, and several other people have made our lives way easier to sort of find and understand what add-ons in the ecosystem are what, the health of them, etc. So anyway, I took a cue from Dan's book, and I kind of did the same thing this week. I pulled down Ember Observer because it's one of the, it's a high-quality, public, open-source Ember app, and Dan had already done the same thing. So as you can see here, we've got like the color palettes used on Ember Observer. We've got the fonts used on Ember Observer. We'll show you some of the different components that are there. Here's the loader component that you would use by putting, it's called dot spinner. You would only maybe see this for a second, but there you go. There's some little tiny components for showing relative time, and you can sort of see the effect of them this way. Human URLs. Let me I'll show you some more. This is the add-on details component. I've got a few different variants set up here. You can see what something with a good score looks like, something with a bad score looks like, work in progress, and so on. So let's do a little live polishing, shall we? What if we wanted to, for some silly reason, snazz up how these things are looking? Let's see what these would look like if we italicized the score. I don't know. I don't think that's quite snazzy enough. So what if we gave them some sort of like pulsing magenta animation to really make the scores jump off the page? You kind of get the idea here. We've got live reload. These are component. I don't have Ember Observer running right now, but I do have components from the app, or well, in this tab rather. But I do have components from the app going, and you can see it's pretty easy to kind of work with them and see them in different ways. Here's all of these same components in the list that you're kind of more familiar with seeing. All right, so you can see, like, I tried to show a few different variations of what this thing would look like. the add-on details component. And you've got, you can have different scores that affect things. If it's a work in progress, it shows WIP instead of that. If there's this show ranking, here, I'll show you the code. If there's this show ranking property set, you see this number instead of the colored score and so on. So as you can imagine, if you really dig into this, and I know that Luke experienced this a lot in the Yap apps, you can kind of get this combinatorial explosion of state that your components can live in many, many, many states. And once you do one dimension times another dimension times another dimension, it gets kind of tricky. So that's kind of where Dan jumped in, and I want to sort of show you the new thing that came in 0.7.0. If anybody is used to Storybook in the JavaScript or Vue communities, there are different add-ons that you can use for Storybook. One of them is called knobs, where you can set the different props of a component that you're previewing sort of interactively. So that's what Dan built. So now, and I'll show you the code in a second behind the scenes, but suffice it to say, you kind of drop this into your Freestyle guide, you can then start to just interact with it. So what if that score was an 8? What if it was a 2? I didn't know this. This is what the color 0 looks like. It's this darker one. If we wanted to see how a component behaves once the input gets really long, it's really nice to just start doing this. This I kind of found interesting. The site doesn't let this happen, but this style actually doesn't live on this component. It lives in a wrapper component that gives that text truncation. But if we were to go ahead in this context and add a rule on specifically on this component, you would see it kind of zap into place. So this is really, really neat. If you have, so these are properties that show the different badges for official add-ons or CLI dependency add-ons, and if something's deprecated, it shows up this way. Again, there's that ranking thing. So this took a lot of thinking and work from Dan and like a few other people. If you check the pull request, it opened in like May, and we just merged it this week. But it's tremendous, and definitely can't thank him enough. And it leaves us in a good point to sort of extend. And there's basically a lot more where we could take. I mean, even just the styles on this form would be a nice, simpler update. But there's a lot of things that, like Luke opened like 27 issues this week on the repository. For example, doing something with prop types where we could probably infer this entire form here just from your prop type definitions on a given component. So let me quickly show you the code that we're talking about. So this dynamic, he called it Freestyle dynamic. That section of the guide that you see right here is right here. So you can see it's there's a little bit of setup, and because this component happened to be it had a property that was a model. You see I'm using the hash helper here, but really all you do is instead of using Freestyle usage, use Freestyle dynamic, and then you put your component in it. In this case, it was add-on details, and just for completeness, I'll show you the. Here we go. This is where we set up the. What did I call it? There we go. The there's like a little bit of boilerplate with this, but this is what we want to sort of clean up next. But suffice it to say, you could make something that just says, hey, I want a checkbox for this property, a number input for this property, a text area for that one, and in pretty short order have something like this up for your components in your apps. So that's pretty much that for the demo. I want to give a little more, like something maybe a little more visual. This is something that Luke shared for some of the Yap components, so you can see changing numeric values, size, color, all kind of live updating right there. I mean, this is really handy for prototyping as well. This is a pretty good feedback loop. This is the diff of what I've currently done against Ember Observer this week. It's really not much. There's just this controller where I'm setting up some test data. We could use Mirage stuff. We could definitely find ways to dry stuff out. I wanted to make sure that I had some different scenarios represented, so I went ahead and just kind of spelled out the different things we were varying on. I put the colors in. These are my silly styles. And then this is the guide right here. So even with the kind of like boilerplate that you get used to, I made some VS Code snippets that can make pretty quick work of it. It's pretty good. I think your best bet for getting going yourself would be to read this really good, I think it's a part 1 blog post from Simp Labs on using Ember Freestyle as a component playground. I'll share everything, all these tabs open, I can post in the Slack so that everyone has it. And then Dan's talk as well, the making of a component guide. I rewatched it today. I hadn't realized it was a PagerDuty hack day, and he used the opportunity to pull Ember Freestyle in, and then apparently won the internal tools portion of the competition, and which means that it was able to go to production. So fast forward, and now we have his contribution in the code base. And then as you can see, once you have familiarized yourselves with these 2 tabs, we got plenty of work if anyone wants to help out and join the fray. So that's about that.
Cool.
Happy to take any questions.
I want to add one thing based on my experience this week doing. Can you open up the code, your Freestyle dynamic example?
You want to see the handlebars?
Yeah.
There you go.
Cool. So I just wanted to point out, in case it may not be totally clear, that this up here, add-on details properties being passed in dynamic. The way that I did it in my templates is I used the hash helper similar to what Chris is using down here to just put the configuration for the dynamic properties right there in line with the template. It's a little, the hash helper, you get a little more parentheses and stuff like that going on, but for me, it's really nice to have it kind of right there locally with what it's yielding now into the template there. So I just wanted to mention that. Also, Chris, should these be using dynamic?
This was a little bit. This was like one layer down, because it's not the direct property. It's the properties of the add-on property.
Gotcha.
So I didn't have time to make a better demo that didn't sort of nest.
And
but yeah, but
normally what you would see here is you would see this dynamic dot property name and anything that you're passing into the component. Okay. Sort of like you see here with show ranking.
yeah. Yeah.
Questions for Chris?
Seems like maybe there's some overlap with integration tests. Like those of you who've used this, how do those relate to one another? How does it work?
You can certainly write tests against this, and I think it's a fantastic idea. Storybook in the JavaScript in the React community primarily has some add-ons for either like built-in snapshot testing or writing actual unit tests against them, because it is really nice, like all the same benefits that we get as like humans looking at this thing and just saying like, hey, I want to look at this component in the 5 different states it could ever be in. It's really nice not to have to like rev your app into that state 5 different times in a test suite. You could just test against this. This is just a route with a template and a controller and components in it. So in that sense, there's nothing special about it architecturally, other than like the magic snippet finding that it's doing that wouldn't be relevant for tests. So yeah, I think it's a great idea. There's nothing, I don't know if anyone else has done that yet. The only things that where I've started into that realm have been on the React side of the fence, unfortunately.
Do you ship your style guide out to production?
It depends. I think you don't have to. It's really up to you. And we did do some work. So obviously, when we're looking at something like this add-on, is using specifically Freestyle for a production thing. If there's something open source or you just want to share it, you can. also, you don't have to have just one. So you could have whatever routes we're using Freestyle components, like you absolutely can ship them to production. We made sure to get the highlight.js stuff out of the payload. We're doing all of that asynchronously. So you'll see like a little flash of non-syntax highlighted content before it comes in, but that saved like 700K on the payload or something. So that said, if you don't want it, I think most people, well, a lot of people explicitly wanted to avoid shipping any of these bits to production. We have instructions in the README for how to blacklist the Ember Freestyle add-on, and it does a pretty good job of getting it all out of there. You have to do some extra work if you actually want to get your route out of production and that sort of thing, and your templates may be hanging around if you're not careful, because that's technically on your app's side of the fence. But at least the add-on bits would be cut out.
The Simple Labs blog post that Chris mentioned talks about how to get that other stuff out if you want.
Yeah.
Let's go over here. We'll come back.
Have you checked out React Cosmos?
A little bit. That's I had it open today. Can you refresh me again?
It's the same kind of thing, but for React. They've done some really smart stuff with like auto scanning your app for all your components. It will automatically sort of create an index for you, and it also has the dynamic box stuff built into it somehow. I don't know fully exactly how, but you can like tweak properties through it, and you can see the source code of the component. You can see, I think you can live edit it.
I'm sure you probably can. All of the almost all of the React stuff that's done this way, because it's just JSX being interpreted. You can just dive in and play around. I was talking with, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Chris Kryko, something. Craig, in the Ember.
Mr. TypeScript, Mr. Ember CLI.
Yeah, in the Freestyle channel in the Ember Slack, we were talking a lot today. Actually, it turned out, thankfully, to be an unrelated performance issue that he had noticed while looking at all of his components in the component guide. But he was doing he's writing some dynamic, like some introspective code to auto-discover all of the usages that he has in sort of one section of his template hierarchy. Luke and I have talked a lot about, there's a project called React Style Guidist that is not, it has maybe only 3,000 stars instead of 15,000 stars that Storybook has, but the philosophy is pretty neat, and I think we could take some inspiration from that, where you can kind of just set up some metadata, annotating or otherwise decorating your components, and that file they happen to just co-locate it with the component that it's talking about. And then, like for us, it would be some sort of broccoli tree where we look for that particular named file and then derive all of the Freestyle usage that we want. And then we could use our component helper to then get it on the screen. In the very first prototypes I did for Freestyle, I was doing something more generative like that. But it wasn't affording us at the time architecturally. It didn't give us the ability to stick the actual component in the template, so that we were looking at real world usage of the template, of the component. So we went in that direction first. When I say we, I mean Luke and I were talking on an Amtrak train for a few hours about it, and said, it's what's most important is that we can stick something in a template that is our handlebars, and then see the result, and then have live update, live reload on it and that sort of thing. But it's not at all exclusive for the type of approach you're talking about. And I would, anyone who's at all interested in that, that's the next thing that I want to work on as well.
Cool. All right, last question if there is one. Aaron, did you have something good? Okay, cool. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a short break for about 5 minutes, and we're going to be back with Katie. If you need Ember help, find them. In addition to that, our speaker, longtime Ember NYCer, a member of the Ember core team, doing a bunch of work I know, in particular on Ember CLI in the past. She's responsible for Ember Try. So basically, your day probably would not run very well if it weren't for Katie. So please help me give a warm welcome to Katie Gengler.
or your day would run a lot better without all my bugs that I wrote. Can you hear me okay? Is this okay?
I think it is.
I'll try to speak louder.
You can hold it too if you want. I don't know.
Yeah, that's okay. All right, so I'm going to talk about Ember 3, which recently, last Wednesday, came out. But not so much about Ember 3 because Ember is a little unusual and that our 3.0 is a garbage collection release. So I started with an introduction, but Luke covered that really well, so I'm going to skip right past that. Yeah, 3.0, it's just it's picking up the garbage and getting rid of it. It contains no new features, but does that mean 3.0 is not exciting? I don't think so. I think it's pretty exciting. I mean, we got a 3. So because of the way this works, any 2.18 app deprecation free should be able to move to 3.0 with very few changes or almost no changes. I moved Ember Observer to 3.0 this past weekend, and this was the diff. I mean, it's a little hard to show on one page, but pretty much the README, the targets file, and package.json in yarn.lock. So not a big deal at all. It's kind of interesting. But so I could tell you about everything that's coming up after 3.0, but that's been really well covered. Martin Muniz gave a talk at Ember Toronto recently, and I think only his slides are available, unfortunately, about what's coming up, and he covered it really well. And a lot of it's going to be covered really well at EmberConf. And so instead, I'd like to look back at 2.0 to 3.0 and see all these features that we got gradually and without breaking anything along the way, like in a really impressive manner. Instead of having to wait for 3.0 and get all these features all at one time, and have to break all our apps and have it be a massive upgrade, we gradually got a whole ton of amazing features, and we had to do almost nothing on our apps to upgrade the minor versions. So I just kind of skipped a slide there. So really the most important thing that changed between 2.0 and 3.0 is we've got 25 new Tomsters and Zoes, including that Ember NYC one. But that's really just a little sarcastic, a little tongue-in-cheek. So in that time period, on the Ember.js repo alone, and this is ignoring Ember Data, Ember CLI, all of the add-ons that go and make up Ember, there's this many closed PRs and this many closed issues, and that's a ton of effort. I just want to kind of give a perspective of everything that's happened in that time, and I don't think there's any way anybody can say Ember is stagnant with this much going on. And I would love to get the stats across all of the different repos. But that was a little bit, I don't know, it's tedious work and I didn't quite get there. So for Ember CLI, it's pretty close to the numbers. It's a lot of work going on there too. And that really, Ember CLI really makes my day-to-day development really nice. I mean, without it, I think I'd be pretty sad. There have been 18 minor versions of Ember, Ember Data, and Ember CLI, not even talking about add-ons. 144 total releases of Ember.js, and I say releasing Ember it's a lot better now than it used to be, but it's not a quick thing to do, so there's a lot of work going on. And 5 LTS versions, 3 of which are still supported, and will be supported for some time. And so now I've created a little bit of a timeline going from 2.0 to 3.0. So we started at 2.0, that was August 13th, 2015. It was also a garbage collection release. There was no new features. There were dropped deprecated APIs, and it introduced the LTS process. And this is time I'm going to go through rather quickly, but I'll share my slides after the fact, so it can be kind of perused. It's interesting to me, even as somebody who's been kind of following Ember along, going through this whole time period. It's interesting to look back and get the whole view of it, and you can kind of see where Ember is going by seeing all these little pieces click into place as you go. So I've intermixed some noteworthy add-ons and other things in the community into this template. So you can think just after 2.0, we got the very first version of Ember Power Select, and it's been really, really nice to have that because I really hate selects. I think along with everybody. So now it's no big deal, and I just use it, and Miguel maintains it for us, and it just always works. And I'm really lazy, so I like using somebody else's work. might be why I like Ember. So with Ember 2.1, I just put some notable things here. I'm leaving out a ton of stuff that's happened. We've got the get helper, which I've been using. I use not too frequently, but sometimes, and it's one of the things you think has always been there, but it's really only been since 2.1. And in my notes, I've also got links to the blog posts for all of these versions, so that could be interesting later. 2.2 was performance improvements and bug fixes. Then we got the first version of Ember Exam, which was mentioned earlier in Gaurav's talk. It lets you parallelize test runs. I use that to make my test runs not make me want to kill myself. And Ember, the very first version of Ember Engines, which lets you, it's kind of like, if a very, 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 very stupid summary of it for me would be that it lets you distribute or break apart your app into different subsets of routes and mount them. I don't know if, not a very good description. And then Ember 2.3 is a flurry of activity. We got the visit API, and that's that was to support fastboot. And then, but if you think further down the line, we'll see what else that kind of unlocked. The hash helper, so that was mentioned just in the freestyle talk by Luke. I use that constantly, and I think it's unthinkable thinking of before it happened. Contextual components, which I think that was a really big deal for the Addon community in a way to create composable components as well. So it made it much easier to create multi-use or reusable components. The get owner API, so that was kind of the one of the final endpoints of a lot of container reworking that happened in the early 2.x days. And Ember Data moved from Bower to NPM, and it became a real add-on. And then we got, in January 2016, we got the first version of Ember Concurrency from Alex. And I remember him giving a talk about it here at Ember NYC. And that has completely changed how I write apps. I don't use plain actions anymore. I almost always use a Ember Concurrency task. And we also got the first version of Ember Composable Helpers shortly after, and that also has changed how my apps look. Instead of having a lot of, well, I still do have computer properties, but instead of having a ton of computer properties that are doing things like filter bys and sort bys, I can do that in the templates instead. And combining that with contextual components, I can filter by and sort by something that's been yielded from I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong. I can filter by and sort by things that have been yielded from components. It has nothing to do with contextual components. And then in February of 2016, we got the Grand Testing Unification RFC. And this RFC had a ton of comments on it. And it was a great grand plan to make testing in integration and unit and acceptance testing all have the same APIs and behave similarly. So it lessened the barrier to learning how to write these tests. And this never landed, but we'll see later on that pieces of it now have landed in more piecemeal. So like this great big RFC is maybe a little unapproachable. 2.4 was the first LTS, and it was the last version to support, without deprecation, the Ember Legacy controllers and Ember Legacy Views add-ons. And those were add-ons that let you use things that were deprecated in the 1.x series, well into the 2.x series, which I think was very generous. It really let you upgrade an app without having to change too much. And we got Zoe in March 2016. In 2.5, we got the test helpers moved to using native events, and this, I think, is really the first small step towards the newer testing APIs that we have today, which I'll cover a little bit later. And very first little tiny step towards that. Ember Data include params on finders, which I find invaluable, especially with JSON APIs, JSON APIs. And the Ember Data References API, which lets you look at the relationships of a model without necessarily materializing the collection or record. We got the module unification RFC, which might be the ultimate RFC there ever was. Yeah. So that was opened in May 2016. So almost, not quite a year and a half, almost 2 years ago. And that we still have not seen the end result of, but there's definitely been progress, and we'll see that as we continue. We got the announcement of sub-teams, and so there was kind of wider acknowledgement and more distributed decision-making for the Ember community as it grows into all these different projects. Ember 2.6 was a quiet release. Then we got the first version of Ember Let. This is another add-on that has changed how my apps look. I use Let in the templates quite frequently. And this later on is RFC'd and added, will be added to Ember. So, and Ember Service Worker, which I don't personally use, but I think is very important for certain types of apps that unfortunately I do not write. 2.7, I don't know why I didn't put bullet points there, but we've got a few things there. Ember binding was deprecated. A couple options and smaller things added. Ember router scroll was the first version of that was in July 2016. I can't see the dates on my screen, that's why I keep leaving it. So this was another thing that was once this add-on was out there, and there were a few add-ons that had attempted to solve this problem. It restores your scroll position once when you change routes on your app. So like if you go back, it'll restore your scroll position to where you were. And there were a few add-ons that attempted to solve it, but this one really kind of, unlocked the door in my opinion. And after this is what I add to my apps, and it forevermore solves that problem. And it's not something I have to think about again. So once again, the Ember community just solves a whole class of problems. Then we got 2.8, which was promoted to LTS, and not too much, some smaller things going on. I hate to minimize that work, but it's not worth mentioning at the moment. Same for 2.9. The module unification RFC was merged with 168 comments. And so I really should have mentioned before that module unification RFC is a re-layout of how the files are on the file system. I think a lot of people here will know that, but maybe not everybody. And that it's a huge undertaking because it involves Ember CLI and Ember itself, and a lot of moving pieces to come together to get that completed. And even to, as you can see from how long this took and how many comments, there were a lot of effort to get consensus on it as well. The first version of Ember Lifeline, which I think this add-on really came out of Ember concurrency, pointing out a lot of the problems with doing async tasks and components where you don't know if the component will still be in existence when the async completes. And it's just a very useful utility. The modules RFC, JavaScript modules RFC was opened. This was for moving things to modules. Instead of having import Ember from Ember, you import the actual utility or function or class that you're going to use from Ember. And so Ember eventually itself will break into modules. Right now it's available to users, but it's not truly in the Ember package, if that makes any sense. And in theory, eventually it could be different NPM packages. Not sure if that is actually planned, but it could be. 2.10 was the first release with the Glimmer 2 VM, and that brought with it a huge drop in template payload size, and is the first, Glimmer VM was something that the entire 2.x series people were working behind the scenes on to get to that point. And it also in this release, the CLI dropped Node 0.10 support. The Addon blueprint testing suggested only testing 2.4 LTS, 2.8 LTS, release beta and Canary. So suggested testing for 1.13 dropped. So the JavaScript modules RFC merged, and you can see that there was a much smaller time span between this merging and being introduced and merging than there was in the modules RFC. and there was in the module unification RFC, though it had a similar number of comments at 153. But I think it was a smaller, easier to digest problem. We got Ember Power Select 1.0 in February last year. And Ember 2.11, we got Ember Source from NPM instead of from Bower. That was pretty nice. And it was the end of support for the end of bug fix support for the 2.4 LTS. 2.12. Okay, I think I lost. 2.11. Ember native DOM helpers came out in February last year. Did I get lost? So Ember native DOM helpers is, you can see, another small step towards or really a big step towards implementing a lot of the ideas that were in that grand testing unification scheme, but was starting to experiment with them in an add-on. So this was the first time you were able to use test helpers like click and visit with async await, so you don't have to use in then. So, and now this eventually, just recently, ends up back in Ember itself. Well, sort of. The 2.12 LTS, just small things. And around at the EmberConf last year, we had Glimmer.js standalone announced, which is the use of the Glimmer VM for a smaller framework, with the idea that you could eventually install your way from Glimmer.js to Ember.js itself. Also at EmberConf, we got this excellent talk by Miguel Camba. I highly recommend you watch it if you haven't seen it, about contextual components. And so, for me, actually, contextual components only started to click just around this time. And you can see that was added way back in the early of the 2.x series. So you can see kind of how the Ember community kind of finally is picking up the pieces that have been laid in the code. Ember 2.13 brought with it the resume test helper, yarn support, translation targets. So with Babel, you can now say, oh, I don't want to support IE11, and so a whole bunch of your code will no longer be some kind of scary transpiled mess that you don't understand. You can actually see the code that you wrote there, and that's very useful because you can drop targets that don't mean anything to you. Babel 6 support, and no more Bower.json by default if you generate an app. The named blocks RFC was opened in May last year. And I believe Alex also gave a talk on this at another Ember NYC meetup, so I won't talk about very much. But something I found interesting as I was going through all of these, the RFCs and issues and PRs to assemble this talk, is that a lot of the RFCs before this RFC are also about things similar to named blocks and starting to solve a very similar problem. So it's interesting that this RFC came along, and this, spoiler, it finally eventually merges. And will eventually be implemented. The Simplify QNet Testing API RFC is opened in June of last year, and that is broken out of the Grand Testing Unification RFC. It is a first pass, and it focuses on integration and unit testing, and it's to get more closely back to real QNet, so you can get QNet's features that QNet has continued to develop, and we had kind of built on top of QNet, and so you kind of get back to QNet so we can get QNet features without having our own custom stuff. So, and 2.14 brought with it a deprecation freeze in prep for Ember 3. So that was in July, so there have been no deprecations added since July that would be until 3.0, and so kind of excessive warning for 3.0 coming up. It also brought NPM 5 and Node 8 support. And in July, we got Fastboot 1.0. And Fastboot allows server-side rendering of Ember apps useful for SEO and other uses where JavaScript is not enabled. In July, we also got, so we're in the middle of a summer where a lot of stuff happens. Ember CLI update, which if you haven't used is an add-on by Kelly Selden that allows you to update your Ember app, and it's smarter than just doing Ember init. So it compares and knows if you've changed a file since you last ran since the blueprints of the last version of Ember that you were on. So instead of having you do compare and be like, oh yeah, I've changed, I haven't, instead of having to ignore certain updates, upgrade after upgrade, you don't. And another option it has is to run available code mods. And so with things like the modules code mod, you can, if you ran update with this add-on, you can just run it inline. I really think this is kind of a game changer for upgrading Ember apps and add-ons, and I've used it for everything since it kind of stabilized at the end of August. The ES classes RFC is opened in July as well. That's one to use ES classes instead of, or in addition to Ember objects as base in Ember apps. So instead of having your service be a Ember object, you could or Ember service object, you could have a ES class style one that extends Ember service. And this is also being worked on. The simplified QUnit testing API is merged in July as well, so it's merging pretty quickly. You can see RFCs seem to be, smaller RFCs merge faster. That's the great lesson. And that was merged with only 37 comments, so it's not controversial. Everybody wants their testing to be cleaner and faster. And the named blocks RFC merges, again, also merges pretty quick. Like I said, it was filling a need that it seemed to be pretty common since all of those many RFCs were around the same topic. The ES classes RFC merged. And then we got the first unit of QUnit DOM, which if you don't know is an extension to QUnit assertions that is geared with the kind of tests that we do in Ember acceptance tests and integration tests in mind. It really makes a clean API. I've converted Ember Observer just this past weekend to using QUnit DOM, so if anybody wants to take a look at what it does for tests, the recent commits are there. We got Ember 2.15 in September 1st. It was the end of bug fix support for 2.8 LTS, the end of security support for 2.4 LTS. Also landed was phase 1 of the router service, and headless Chrome by default for testing, and so no longer testing in Phantom by default in the blueprints. The browser support RFC changes was opened, and so this is the RFC that was in preparation for Ember 3.0 to drop IE support for IE9, IE10, and Phantom. And it's open and it's relatively quickly closed, and since we've got Ember 3, we've dropped those browsers. 2.16 was an LTS. It was also the first release where the Ember modules API is available. And so things like import computed from add_ember/object, and this came out of that JavaScript modules RFC that we discussed earlier. And it's not required. It still isn't required. You can still import Ember from Ember, and that's fine. So it's an optional, for now, an optional movement. The browser support RFC changes is merged. The first version of Pre-Ember, which is an interesting add-on that lets you generate static pages from Ember apps. And I find that interesting for, having the, you can build the, marketing part of your app in Ember as well and generate it as static pages and not have to worry about running fastboot just because the marketing app wants to be available for SEO. A lot of interesting options are unlocked with that. Doing things like, I'm blanking on the name of the static generator that Ruby uses, even though I use it all the time. Middleman, thank you. The acceptance testing refactor RFC is opened, and this is pretty much an RFC to make acceptance testing have the same helpers as integration, and to pretty much bring Ember native DOM helpers back into the fold. So, and have testing look like async, await, and instead of killing end then. The setup of the testing is also proposed to change, and that's actually included in the blueprints with 3.0. 2.17 is bug fixes and performance improvements. We got the acceptance testing refactor RFC merged in December, and we're quickly coming up on where we are now. Then we have a flurry of RFC activity in Ember that had people joking about an Ember advent calendar. We have the template-only component RFC opened, which is an RFC for components that only have template, no backing JavaScript class. They wouldn't have a wrapping div, and you would reference. There was an additional RFC for params where you reference them with an @ sign for anything that's been passed in. I encourage reading it. This is something that becomes an optional feature because it's really hard to add this without breaking, so you have to consciously opt into it. Another RFC for similar problem, remove the application template wrapping div. So for as long as I can remember, the application that you run is wrapped in a div. It's, with a class of Ember View or something like that. And so this is an RFC to remove that and it's also an optional feature because it could potentially be breaking, because you could accidentally be relying on that div in CSS or in other JavaScript. The ES getters RFC is opened, and so this is the much awaited and much anticipated removal of .get, except it's not the removal of .get, it's an option to not use .get on some but not all objects when possible. Yeah, there's a whole big caveats there. So like you can't use them on proxies or anything that uses unknown property. But for most of the time, if you're doing this.get, you could do this.get foo can become this.foo. We also got the blocklet RFC, which is moving that part of Emberlet into Ember, just the block format of it. I guess that's in the name there. 2.18 is an LTS as the last one of the 2.x series. And then we get a whole slew of those RFCs merged, all of the ones I just mentioned. And we get another RFC for making jQuery optional. And there was a flurry of activity on this in early January with an issue for all of the work that was necessary. And eventually blocklet gets merged, jQuery optional is merged, and then the next thing that happens is we get 3.0. Yeah. So, as I said before, it dropped IE9, 10, and Phantom.js support. Drops publishing to Bower and Global's releases. We got a new package, Ember source channel URL, which helps you get the package names for the latest Canary and beta, and that's used by Ember Try for the different channels. The default blueprint changes to that new testing style that I've been talking about. But to upgrade to Ember 3.0, you don't have to take that new testing stuff, and you can even get the new testing stuff before 3.0 if you really want it. So it's not coupled to 3.0, it's just the blueprint changes for the default for new apps especially. That could throw you for a loop when upgrading, so just keep in mind that you don't have to take those test helper removal changes. It removes all the deprecated APIs. There's a huge list. I'm not going to go into it. Add support for async await in the default blueprint. Mostly that's done through targets and a maybe import regenerator add-on. And the Ember 2 legacy add-on is available if you need it, which brings back all of the APIs that were dropped, and that will be supported until I think 3.4, the first LTS. So yeah, it's pretty. It's a non-event, but it's also the culmination of all of 2.x to 2.0 to 3.0, and you can see how the footprint started from the RFCs to reworking an RFC to an interesting add-on, and then gets incorporated into Ember, or the add-on's fine by itself, and it just changes how you write your apps. So moving beyond 3.0, we have the a lot of the, you had to look at the RFCs that are kind of in the air. They've been merged, but they're not released yet. And so you can look at that and you can really tell what's coming. Though, I mean, no, nothing's saying there won't be a random RFC written and written, commented on, and then really emerged. So 3.1.0 beta has the ES5 getters on by default right now. And so a lot of people are upgrading it through the beta to try it, and I highly recommend doing that because it's a kind of a big change, a big option to not have to use .get. And 3.1 beta also has the concept of optional features. And optional features, as I mentioned with those two RFCs, and those are the 2 or 3 RFCs, and those are the ones that kind of inspire this, is that you have to opt into them. You have to turn them on for your application and kind of acknowledge that you know that it might be breaking. So you're not forced into it. You can leave them off, but if you turn them on, you have to be aware. And I think there's even a code mod for the template-only Glimmer components optional feature that lets you turn it on and then generate a JavaScript file, even an empty component backing file, for all of those empty ones, just to make sure it won't be breaking, and you can remove them if you want to. So again, thinking about those RFCs that haven't been implemented, we've got, I think, at the forefront module unification. And I know there's been a lot of progress on that, and I would look at what Matthew Beal has been up to, because his talk at EmberConf is about module unification. So I imagine I know that he's working hard on that. jQuery removal, I would say that's in progress, and I don't think that there's much left to do on that, but there's all tracking issues for all of these. Named blocks, I look eagerly awaiting those. And blocklet, same thing, another one that's been merged, and we don't have it yet, but it's behind a future flag. So I left a ton out, and I was highlighting only the things that I thought was interesting to see the evolution, kind of the steps. I'm sure I missed some that would have been interesting as well. And I don't think I gave it anywhere near enough credit to the stuff that has gone on with the learning team during the 2.x to 3.x series. I would say the guides, the API docs, I think they're all Ember apps now. They're versioned, and everything has been much improved. There's a status board where you can look at all these different initiatives. I'm sure I left out some of these initiatives, which, and I think it's pretty amazing how much work gets done on Ember, especially if you look across the ecosystem. That's all I got.
Cool. Questions for Katie on this, and can we open it up to kind of wider Ember questions too?
So another thing that I think has had a lot of progress but wasn't mentioned was the TypeScript stuff.
I don't personally use TypeScript, but I know that there is an add-on that I think is well supported of it, Ember CLI TypeScript, and I know that I think at some point it's fundamentally harder with the way Ember works. And what I know from paying attention is that ES classes and ES5 getters and all that kind of stuff eventually unlocks better TypeScript support.
So I use Ember.js a lot for the when I'm trying to get a property that I don't know if it's going to be there, and it's a lot easier. So I know there's an ES 2019 or something with the optional chaining or something. How does that affect the ES5 getters and stuff?
So I guess I should repeat the question, which is how does long chains of this.get or Ember.get affect affected with the ES5 getters? And the answer is that it's gonna be very different. If you have a long chain of things, you need to check that the intermediate values aren't null. And there is that thing in ES 2019, which I don't remember the name of. And
it's optional chain or something. It's
yeah.
Really weird syntax.
Yeah, I remember that as well. I remember seeing that.
It should just work, right?
Okay.
I think it will.
If you just do.
If you do this.get a.e.c, B is fine. Doing an error if you're trying to
Yeah, that should, yeah.
It should work with all the, like, you know,
Yeah.
observability or object
And there's like a Babel transform for it, but I'm always scared of using things that are in a Babel transform that might not actually land. What's that?
I had a question. Yeah, so it seems like you have a pretty good grasp of like the Ember ecosystem overall. I find myself kind of getting more, I go kind of deeper in a few projects and they take a lot of time, and all this stuff kind of happens, you know, it's been, a year goes by and all this stuff happens and I find myself like, you know, losing track of where things are. So I was just wondering, since you do work on a project like Ember Observer and you know, you compile this presentation, like, do you have any tips that you found from learning how to keep up with everything that's going on in the Ember ecosystem?
Yeah, I also find myself unable to keep up with everything. So I guess the question is how to keep up with everything in the Ember ecosystem. You could give a talk like this. That really helped. I went back and read all of the blog posts, and then I also looked at a lot of the Ember weeklies, and I looked at a lot of the change logs, and I found a lot of things I was like, oh, that's a feature. I had no idea I could do that. And a lot of those didn't even get mentioned because I was kind of looking for a higher level view in the RFCs. And I don't know. It's hard to keep track of. I think just paying attention to those blog posts usually have the more important type things. The things that I mostly didn't get from the blog posts were more internal type things, like things that don't necessarily get, you know, written up for users, like performance changes or architecture changes and that kind of things.
I've played around with some of the new testing unification stuff, like Ember native helpers, and it seems like a lot of it's implemented in if you can import it, doing like @ember/test helpers, but it hasn't really shown up in an official release blog post. I was wondering if you know, is that going to be in like 3.1 or do you know what release they're talking about?
So the 3.0 includes, if you generate a new app in 3.0, it will be set up with the new testing stuff.
So it doesn't use module for acceptance, it uses module.
It uses module, yeah, just plain module from QUnit.
In fact, you might be surprised when you run Ember CLI update.
Yes,
It
that's
removes
what I
your
was
module
mentioning.
from your acceptance file.
So
I was surprised
yeah.
by this.
So with upgrading Ember Observer, I took 3.0 first and just didn't take any of those updates to the test folder, test helpers folder.
Right.
And then I subsequently did the upgrade. But I've got multiple apps running with the new testing stuff. It's great. It's really nice. The biggest issue is that if you use a lot of Sizzle specific selectors like
Right.
:contains, :equal, you have to kind of rewrite some of those, which is kind of tedious. But if you want to not write and then ever again, that's what you have to do.
So the guides have that, like the guides for 3.0 in the testing section have all of these things?
That's a great question. I have no idea.
They do. I was looking
They're,
at it.
Yeah?
they're sort of, well, last time I looked, like last week, they were half and half.
Okay.
Maybe they improved.
Today I was using it literally today, and it was,
Oh, that's
it was
cool.
very useful.
Awesome.
That
The
learning
other-
team is silent
the other
but
kind of
effective.
major difference in moving to the new testing stuff, that besides what Katie just mentioned, is that your helpers, like if you have custom helpers for acceptance tests, you're used to calling register helper, register async helper, and those things being globals. That's gone completely in the new stuff. So you just write a traditional module and import it and use it. It's way simpler and more straightforward, but might have you scratching your head at first if you don't know
Yeah.
what's gonna happen.
And like those test helpers used to get the app passed in as the first parameter, and so if you want that now, you have to explicitly pass this .owner into that as those helpers. So Ember feature flags includes a helper, and now the first parameter to it is this .owner. So because it needs to be able to look up the feature service. Other interesting thing with the new testing stuff is that you get the ability to register a replacement service built in, so you don't need an add-on to do that anymore. You don't need to do some crazy path with a lot of underscores to be able to override a service.
One more thing that might get you is that Ember CLI Mirage doesn't seem to start up correctly. I don't know what to do about that.
Nobody did.
We can solve that one.
I did that in Ember Observer, and so what I did was disable Mirage completely for the testing environment, And then I made a custom module for Ember Observer, or now instead of module for acceptance, you have a regular module and you call setup application test. So I made a custom setup Ember Observer test, and in there, in the before each, assign start Mirage, assign it to server, and in the after each, clean it up. And that's because I want a clean Mirage for each test.
I copied Katie without realizing it.
No, I think we're all copying somebody, right?
Same. Other questions? All right, cool. Thank you to Katie. Thanks. And thank you as well to Gaurav and Chris and Ray. Thank you to Movable Ink for hosting. We are going to go across the street and have a drink if anybody's interested. I also have stickers. If you'd like a sticker, let me know. And we'll be back here for Thursday, March 22nd. I'll post it on tonight for our Thanks, everybody.